An eerie mist has settled over a small village. Shadows stir beneath an ancient barrow, and legends of old have begun to wake, stirring in the night and moving against the seemingly innocent villagers who sleep peacefully in their beds. Hello adventurers and welcome back to the Red Quills. My name is Ryan, and in this series we've been exploring creating different kinds of maps that can help you construct your adventures and the kinds of adventures that you can make for your players. In this case, I'm going to be making 3 different maps for a specific kind of adventure. This one is going to be focused a lot on exploration and intrigue, gathering some hints about the ancient history of the area and going to confront the newly risen once and future king in a twist on an ancient Arthurian myth. I'm going to start by creating the grid map for this, and then I'm going to go through and make the other 2 maps that I've made for several of the other adventures that I've done in this series. The wilderness map, which is an overview of the final encounter area, and the isometric view of the town of Billingston. Now, this is an adventure that I've actually run for my own players, and it was one that involved a great deal of role play and exploration and strategizing in the end, and I managed to tie it into a larger narrative. But in order to create this adventure, I've pared it back so that it can be played out in 1 or 2 sessions. But overall, the lore of it is pretty simple. As I go through, I'm going to be creating the grid map first, and that involves going around and making the outline with some acrylic paint pens, and then doing some more detailed work with some fineliners. Then when I do the wilderness map, it'll be the same process of doing the colors in the acrylic first and then the details in the fineliner. But the isometric map is done entirely in fineliner pen, moving from outlines, which are done in a thicker 0.6mm, down to doing the details in a 0.5mm. And you can see the process as I go through and I do that. But talking about the adventure itself, I'm working on the idea of the Arthurian myths, where King Arthur is the mythical figure who will rise again in England's hour of greatest need. And there's a lot more detail to the myth than that, but that's the basics of what I want to do. So in the lore of this particular world, long ago, back when the kingdom wasn't founded, there were a lot of different feudal lords. And one of them had a particular spell cast upon him when he died, so that he would rise again when his people were threatened. And over time, his kingdom dwindled and died, and eventually was lost, so that no one even remembered the myth of his death. But when the villagers here begin to dig up the old barrows and exhume some of the old citizens of that kingdom in the hopes of enriching themselves, they trigger the ancient mechanism by which this long-dead king would come back and confront them. And so we create a situation in which the bad guy is actually defending people and working from a noble cause, even though on the surface he looks evil. The enemy itself in this case is a wraith, a moderately ethereal being who is served by a variety of undead that he's using to terrorize the villagers. So there are several stages to this particular adventure. It begins with a brief information gathering part, then some exploration of the history and the area, and then the confrontation in the barrow itself. There's a lot of combat in this particular adventure as well, ones that will allow the players to take down undead, which are a traditionally uncomplicated nemesis. There's no problems about returning to the grave, something that has already risen from it after all. But the bad guy is someone I've tried to add a little bit more dimension to. The king, Eldolier, genuinely believes that he is working in his people's best interest and is in absolute denial about the fact that his kingdom is now long gone. He thinks he's only been dead for about 50 years, doesn't understand what has happened to his daughter or granddaughter. And so I've tried to reflect that in the maps that I've made. The village of Billingston is quite small because I want the players to remain focused on what the problem is. And in order to reinforce the solution or the cause of their problems, I've made the whole village built around an ancient barrow in which the villagers have created a hall. Now this is a really obvious metaphor for precisely what they've done. The problem of the quest is that the villagers have begun to dig up an old barrow nearby where Eldolier was buried. They're selling the treasures to a local university in order to fund themselves and enrich themselves, and they call it Billingston Mine. even though it's just a fancy grave robbing. But in the center of their village is an old barrow. It's much smaller than the one in which the players can find Eldolier. But the villagers have hollowed it out and built it up so that it is their town hall, which allows us the opportunity to make it into a combat encounter, yes, and there are provisions for that in the adventure module, but it also really brings back home to the players that this is the cause of the problems, the casual disrespect of the burial of that ancient kingdom. There are several people in the town that they can talk to, the mayor, the abbot, the local trader, and of course several villagers as well. And while the quest goes on, there are environmental dangers in the form of the occasional undead patrol sent by Eldolier and a magical mist that lies heavy over the area, stopping the sun from shining upon the undead and weakening them. When Eldolier is killed later on, the mist rises, and the players take that as a sign that everything is safe. But the combat of this encounter takes place in his barrow, where the king was buried, and I've constructed it to reflect the kind of threat that the players can encounter. There's a long main barrow that has several chambers leading up to the final encounter, and of course a treasure. And of course there are two ante-chambers, in which you can find evidence of precisely what the villagers have been doing, yes, but also an optional encounter with one of the risen undead who has retained their personality, if not their ability to speak, and who will painstakingly begin to write on the walls his account of how he lived long ago, which will humanize the undead and remind the players that the people that they are fighting were not the monsters that they currently see. As they go through, there are more clues. The wights that they kill are all wearing the same sigil and have swords engraved with their names. In the barrow itself, there are large plaques reminding those who come to pay respects of the great deeds of these knights who once served the mythical king. And then finally, in the deepest chamber, you find the king himself. A wraith, risen to ethereal form, possessed of a hatred of those who would defile and desecrate his grave. He can be convinced to leave the villagers alone if the players can find enough evidence that his kingdom has gone, so that he can pass on peacefully. However, much more simple and direct is facing him in combat, which, though it does contain its dangers, is a more direct method of figuring out this particular problem. And like all adventures, this adventure has the option for the players to be rewarded for their efforts in the forms of the treasures of the old king, the swords and armors of the ancient knights, and the occasional valuable that they may find in the barrow. Although doing so runs the risk of them becoming just like the villagers who raised this particular problem. Whether or not your players have a problem with that is entirely up to them. We're adding a little bit of depth here. And so when we're done, we have the description of the village of Billingston, the story of the town that the players can begin to unfold and unravel, the option for strange encounters in the night, a rising terror in an environment that obeys the commands of its once and future king, and of course, a deep and layered villain in the form of the king who wants to defend the long-dead kingdom. And you can find all the details for this as well as the maps that I've just made in the link in the description below. It's available for free on my Patreon. If you have any questions, as always, because these videos are shorter than the ones that I generally make, you can stick them in the comments below. Any likes or comments are very appreciated. But if you wanted to discuss them more at length, you can also check out the Red Quill's map making server on Discord, where we share our map making and world building concepts as a group. There we have polls on what's coming up. You can talk to me directly about videos, and I share the occasional behind the scenes insight into what I'm creating. And if you wanted to support us on Patreon, please do. And as a thank you to everyone who does, in addition to the adventure module, which is available for free along with the maps, I'll also be releasing atlas excerpts of the village of Billingston and Billingston Mine that will be added to the atlas at the end of this series. So once again, thank you to everyone who has supported. If you have any questions, stick them in the comments below. I will leave any details about the materials that I used to create this map. But until next time, and when we'll be creating our next map, which is the last in this particular series, and in which we'll be revisiting one of the fan favorites, the maps of the Tor network. Good luck with your own adventures, and I'll see you then.